Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren,
ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, I am very grateful to see you here. I would like to thank you on behalf of the World Economic Forum and Federation of Swiss Protestant Churches for thronging into this hall today. And I like to welcome you here at the Swiss Alpine Middle School. I'm sure that some of you were great fans of the Swiss football team last summer, and in that case you were supporting a multicultural team because hardly any of the players have any Swiss roots. Most of them come from abroad, have a foreign background and origin, and therefore they are a reflection of Switzerland with its more than 20% of foreigners as a share of the population, with many foreigners who have become Swiss nationals. Switzerland that has a tremendous tradition and history of multiculturalism with its 4 cultures and 4 national languages. The multicultural society in Switzerland, within this meaning, has been a reality for a long time. Now the question is, do you think it's a good thing? Is it a good thing? And how do we cope with it? In the past few years, on this issue of multicultural society, another question has arisen, and that is the relationship between Christianity and Islam. So we're not just going to talk about the multicultural society today, but also the multi-religious, multi-confessional society. Now, before we start the panel discussion, before I introduce the panelists to you, I would warmly wish to welcome our Minister of Foreign Affairs and Acting President of the Swiss Confederation, Calmy-Rey, who is going to address us with an opening statement.
My name.
Ladies and gentlemen, since the 90s, there has been a kind of a key word going around Europe and the world, and that word is multiculturalism. Originally, multiculturalism, the word, was a linguistic reaction to a changing situation in the world, or more specifically, that many people have become migrants again, that they now have to live and work elsewhere than where they grew up and where they received their first cultural imprint. Originally, this word, multiculturalism, had a very optimistic tone along the lines that there is room in a tolerant society, room for many different cultures, as long as we as human beings continue to talk to one another and, despite our differing origin, accept common values. Multiculturalism therefore said or stated that the world is more interesting, more varied and more multicolored when people don't just wear traditional costumes but also saris and Turkish pants. However, today, now at the beginning of the 21st century, this word multiculturalism has become more problematic from various points of view. Sometimes it has even become an insult. There are people in Germany, for example, who say that the project multiculturalism has failed. The so-called cultural variety, in actual fact, was simply a collection of problems in the field of integration and of society, of decay of values and violence. Instead of a multi-checkered and joyful multiplicity of cultures, one in reality simply had aggressive communities of immigrants who demand tolerance but are not willing to integrate. Now, have we also reached this state in Switzerland, a classical country of emigration and immigration that also has a lot of cultural variety because of its linguistic background? I believe that this is not so, but we have to do everything we can to prevent that this occurs. So when I use the term multiculturalism today, then I would simply like to recall its optimistic origin. First of all, that all of us, despite our differences in origin, gender, color, skin, religion and language, participate in a common destiny of mankind, that all of us have the same interest in freedom, peace, justice, security, joy and culture. Secondly, all of us have the same right to be different, to have our own identity, or in short, it's difference only that generates culture. Culture is always multi. A uniform culture would mean the end of culture. Culture always has as a meaning to give the other individual the right to be him or herself, to be a special person with special gifts, weak and strong points and interests. Culture contains as a meaning the multiplicity of the planet and the unity of human nature. This as a preface. Ladies and gentlemen, one talks very loudly and without reticence about what separates the different cultures in our country. When the cashier, women cashiers in the supermarket wear a scarf, then this triggers off discussions about the identity of Switzerland. Instead of the scarf being a traditional piece of clothing, they become a symbol, a sign which indicates other signals again. I am fully aware of the fact that we are confronted with very complex and interdependent problems today, problems which are continuously changing, and there is no panacea for these problems. We must try together to solve them together, and I'm quite sure that we will be able to do so as long as we forego posturing that is extreme or simply attracts the attention of the media, and instead rely on a method that still is and always has been the key to our balance and equilibrium, striving for consensus. More than ever before, I'm convinced that there are common values on which we can build and on the basis of which we can make a contribution to the further development of society, a society that respects differences without giving up common values. We all have different identities of differing makeups. I, for example, am a person who comes from the canton of Valais. I'm also from Geneva and from Bern. Moreover, my identity is both feminine, Swiss French, and social democratic. I'm marked by Christian culture. Nonetheless, as Federal Councillor, I also represent men, people in the German-speaking Switzerland, Jews, Muslims, and agnostics. I have learned that, depending on the circumstances, I can get on famously with both an Arabic Muslim or a Christian French woman. We often hear that Switzerland is a nation built on will, because it doesn't have a national foundation of common language, common culture, or common ethnic origin. That is true. But what defines us? What unites us? What is Swiss about Switzerland? The will unites us to respect every individual and every group which and who is different, and yet we have the will to take on what needs to be dealt with in common. It is the will to create and live in a country that is constituted on the basis of common rules, and the set of rules are our institutions, direct democracy, federalism. What defines Switzerland is to make a political whole of this through our institutions. Swiss people are united by the fact that they live together in their differences, can underline it, and respect one another. This is how, in the Confederation, town and country have found agreement, Catholics and Protestants, German, French-speaking, Romansh, and Italian-speaking Swiss. The pattern has always been the same. The existing society creates space for the others, the ones who arrive afresh. These sit down with us at the table and assume the joint responsibility for everything in a finely tuned balance. This is how the mosaic of Swiss society came about, and this is how we build on it piece by piece. We cultivate our multilingualism. This is a common political project. This living multilingualism is one of the glues that bonds the Confederation and is therefore of great value, a good that we have to foster and care for. Now, I'm very pleased to see that the cantons of Thurgau and Schaffhausen, as well as the canton of Zurich, have voted in favor of teaching 2 foreign languages, including 1 national language, at primary schools. Furthermore, I believe that we should not only learn and promote the learning of national languages, we also have to make sure that they are spoken in the council institutions and in the federal administration. I therefore plead in favor of equal use of High German and the minority languages. When I speak about pluralistic Switzerland, then this is also because we are confronted with a new situation. Our whole system is confronted with a new situation. Our multiplicity is real and goes beyond what is laid down in the Constitution, like our 4 national languages. In our cities, we have people from all walks of life from the whole planet who are residents. Of our 7.5 million inhabitants, about 21% are of foreign nationality. That is internationally seen one of the highest percentages. 4/5 of these come from Europe, nearly 900,000 come from the EU and EFTA countries, and the largest group is made up of Italians and people from former Yugoslavia. Then asylum seekers and refugees count 55,000 and therefore only account for a very tiny percentage, just as the 90,000 or the estimated 90,000 individuals who officially do not exist because they have no papers. More than 1/3 of the foreign population has a different language than one of the 4 national languages. The percentage of these individuals has multiplied by 4 in the last 50 years. Today in Switzerland, just as much Serbo-Croatian is spoken as Italian, and just as much Italian is spoken as our 4th national language, Romance. That's Switzerland. And she will continue to change along these lines. The variety of cultures in Switzerland, therefore, is not an illusion, it is a reality. Of course, you do not doubt this reality when you put the following question: whether society is an illusion. What you are interested in is the cohesion of society, or respectively, whether in this multicultural society there is sufficient commonality in order to ensure its survival and cohesion. You are really asking about integration. It is wrong to assume that the Swiss and the foreigners form 2 homogeneous groups in our society. It's even completely wrong, but I'll come back to this later on. But let's, for simplicity's sake, simply assume that the foreigners in Switzerland are the group that are different and that they are challenging Swiss identity. But these foreigners, in fact, do not have the same quality of life as the average Swiss. Foreigners are concerned and affected more by poverty and unemployment and paid less. An investigation of the Forum on the Research into Migration in Neuchâtel has proved that young people with a surname that ends in "ich" probably will not be considered as much for a job than persons with a traditional Swiss name. Statistics also show that the second generation of immigrants in Switzerland are represented much better than the Swiss average. So 2 things can be concluded from this. First of all, the foreigners of the first immigrant generation are not integrated well. Secondly, their their youngsters, the youngsters of the second generation, are integrated well. This can be measured. Integration means equality of opportunities. It is achieved when the statistics don't find a significant difference between different groups of society with regard to training, education, unemployment, social assistance, poverty, invalidity, crime, health, or from the point of view of their political representation. In these terms, then, of course, we do not just have problems between the integration of the Swiss and foreigners. Women just as much have a problem of integration. They are not integrated as well in society. They do not get paid the same for same work, and their share in political power by far does not correspond to their share in the population. Ladies and gentlemen, Swiss modern diversity and variety came about and continues to come about thanks to immigration. The different nationalities and ethnic groups joined Switzerland wave after wave and integrated themselves piece by piece into the mosaic of Switzerland. The French Huguenots were the first ones. They are at the origin of the Geneva private banks, ending in the entrepreneur Nicholas Hayek, who came from Lebanon and who saved the Swiss watch industry. But in every wave of immigration, there is complaint about this variety, too large variety of the newcomers, the too big difference between us and them, lack of labor and work, and fierce competition. So the question is, are we still able to reach consensus? Do we have a sufficient ability to live together for cohabitation to take on this challenge? I would answer this question with a firm yes. We have no reason whatsoever to fear this encounter. Our entire history has been marked by these movements of migration. First emigration, later on by immigration. We have always been able, without having to give up our identity, to accept changes and to find a new balance. Nonetheless, migration can lead to social tension between the newcomers and those who have been here for generations. In addition to that, since the terror attacks of New York, Madrid and London, there has been public debate, to some extent polemic, about the daily cohabitation with a Muslim minority. This debate makes it very clear which tensions can be generated by the presence of habits and traditions that are not do not coincide with Switzerland's traditions. But differences between cultures, language, religion and traditions are something that mark all human societies. Look at the story of Abraham in the Bible, in the Quran and in the Torah, just as the myths of the creation of peoples in the South Pacific and the theories of anthropology and ethnology. Civilizations are not faceless, homogeneous structures. More than that, every civilization has its identity, culture and its politics, its system of references that develop further in a continuous exchange with other reference systems from other civilizations. This interaction between the I and the other always leads to conflicts and to convergence. When relations become very aggressive, some systematically say that the other is at fault, and others, on the other hand, see themselves as the culprits. These two positions have caused a lot of evil, and we know that both positions are not good because they turn us, the West, into the only actor, whereas all the others are just the observers and therefore objects of our action. Ethnic, cultural and religious difference are enriching, but potentially they can also cause problems. This is why one should ask this question here, as everywhere in the world, what we have to do in order to live together in freedom, peace and human dignity. we can look at the history of this philosophy of freedom and justice. Rousseau formulated it and was further developed by Kant and Schiller. Karl Barth, Albert Schweitzer, Karl Jaspers, Hannah Arendt and Hans Küng have also debated it. They have all played in favor for dialogue, for the search for common, just and binding values, for the idea of a human nature that we all have in common, that knows no cultural or religious differences. Nonetheless, this common ethic, or the idea of a common ethic, has not proven its worth in the 21st century. An ethic with which all individuals can identify, regardless of their race, their origin, their social status, gender, their beliefs or political convictions. Such an ethic is still not self-evident, and even less so is it seen as an achievement of civilization. Of course, we can hold to the golden rule, which states that don't do to others what you do not want to be done to you. All cultures and religions know this principle, according to which we define morals and justice. Hannah Arendt wrote that our freedom ends there where the freedom of our fellow human beings begins. That sounds lovely, but its practical implementation is very limited, because how are we to know where our freedom begins and ends? Values don't grow on trees, but they grow within the framework of historic processes, in thought, in speech, in political practice. We have to debate about these values, test them, foster them, pass them on, and possibly also defend them. And we have to accept the obligations that are linked to them. Now, what about Western values? If you examine them more closely, we see that there are no Western values which are not at the same time also simply human values, and therefore held in common by all human beings. The nature of man is universal, just as universal as the need of every man and woman to have and hold values which help them to find their way around in their life and which protect their human dignity. Within this meaning, Asian and African societies do not necessarily have to follow the historic development of the West in order to discover the universality of these values. Of course, values are universal, but they are not absolute. They always have to be finely tuned and balanced. Values are ideals according to which societies and individuals strive for, all in their own way. And this striving takes on different forms and shapes and change according to time and location, according to traditions, habits and custom. Values are not rules that have been laid down once and for all, or which forbid any independent interpretation or adaptation, or would make it impossible. So let's come back to the scarf of the woman cashier. Is it a sign of oppression of women, or is it simply a confirmation of one's own identity? We should not interpret too strictly all these signs and forms of values, nor religious rules, dogmas and traditions. Signs and signals don't have one meaning, and this also applies to religions. The meaning of signs, practice and rules can change from one person to the next, from society to society, from generation to generation. Universal values are expressed in a very large range of traditions and culturally marked perceptions. Of course, the presence of the other often provokes a feeling of loss of identity, loss of home and origin, as the Turkish sociologist Nilüfer Göle wrote. We often react to such feelings by alienation, by exclusion. But if we do this, the other becomes even more foreign, and it becomes even more difficult to find commonality and to build on relationships. if we speak about integration, we also have to achieve it and do it by taking into account values which have practical meaning. Values are neither laws nor orders which have to be followed according to the letter. They are ideals, they are directives, they help us to orient ourselves, they are ideals, they are targets that we would like to achieve, and that is what unites societies, this movement towards these targets. There will never be absolute justice on this earth, but the idea that there should be just conditions is something we have to hold to. This is where we have to, what we have to build on. We cannot put all people into the same basket. Quite on the contrary, values should help us to allow all sorts of people to participate in this unity of human nature. This is something we cannot order or force. This is something that has to be done in practical work and has to be tested continuously. Now, what does this mean for us in Switzerland in 2007? It means that we have to intervene in this current debate about integration and foreigners, about identity and being other. That is to say, we have to think about what unites people who live in Switzerland, not try and focus on what separates them. That means that all of us have to be willing to make space for differing cultures, ethnic groups and religions that live side by side in Switzerland, that all of us have the duty and have to recognize this duty that we commit ourselves for the Swiss commonality and common will. All of us have the right to be part of it, but no one has the right to be in a ghetto. Everyone has the duty to work for the common will. No one has the right to try and impose his or her recipe as being the only panacea. In any case, integration has to take place on the basis of the Constitution. All who live in Switzerland have to observe our legal order and system and our social rules that give sufficient freedom for the practicing of individual rights. Whoever does not respect these rules will be sanctioned. However, there's no reason to have special sanctions for individual groups. And we have never done this in the original 4 groups of populations in Switzerland, and we'll certainly not do it with regard to those groups that have immigrated into Switzerland. Switzerland, in historical terms, is an exemplary success story of integration, and I see how Switzerland should not be able to cope with these modern challenges of this multivariate cohabitation. Ladies and gentlemen, our efforts in favor of integration of the migrants come from the same source as our striving to protect minorities, to help the various cultures to develop and to promote our 4 national languages. So let us focus on the cohesion of our country and on the institutions that are its foundation, so that we can cope with the challenges which face us now, the protection of minorities, migration and integration. Thank you for your attention.
Herzlichen Dank, Frau Bundespräsidentin. Ich stelle Ihnen nun gern unser Panel hier.
Well, let me introduce the panelists on my left here. We've got Rifat Lensin. She is an Islamic scholar and vice president of the Interreligious Community of Switzerland. To my left, we have Safwat Baiady, the president of the Protestant churches in Egypt. He is co-chairman of the Economic Council of the churches in the Middle and Near East. And to my right, we have Susan Colin Marks. She is Senior Vice President of the organization Search for Common Ground. That is an international non-governmental organization which for the past 20 years has worked for the peaceful resolution of conflicts. Further to the right is Thomas Wipfel. He is our host, as it were, president of the Council of the Swiss Federation of Protestant Churches and chairman of the Council of the Religions in Switzerland. And Hans Fehr, National Council of the Swiss People's Party for independent and neutral Switzerland. Mr. Baiady, many people in Switzerland doubt that there is a long-term, sustainable, peaceful coexistence of Muslims and Christians, that is actually possible in the long term. Well, for decades, you've had your own experience. What has been your experience about this?
Thank you. I'm very delighted and thankful for this invitation to be in the midst of you and to listen to the wonderful speech you just heard. I am coming from a very, very old history. I am from a family of 2,000 years old, as Christian family in Egypt, carrying the layers of cultures, the Pharaohs, the Roman, the Greek, the Romans, the Christians, and the Arabs. 640 Arabs came to Egypt with 4,000 soldiers. The church was under the Roman supervision in Egypt. So the church facilitated for the Arabs to come to Egypt. In the time being, Christians are the minority, 75 millions, and among the 75 millions, there are 10 millions, approximately 10 millions of Christians. The majority of the Christians are the Coptic Orthodox, the old church. The Protestant is the minority of the minority. So we are the minority, but the second in large after the Orthodox Church, then comes after the Protestant, the Catholic Church. We learned how to live. From time to time we have conflicts, yes, especially in the 20 or 30 years ago. But we learned from the conflicts how to live together. I participate in dialogue on the level of religious people, the leaders of Christian Muslims in Egypt, also in the Middle East, where we had also the Jewish leaders talking together. But I observed that the practical life, the service and ministry to the people is more effective than talking. As an example, when we have the schools, the church runs schools, the schools are open to everybody, where the children come and the parents come. And then we live the dialogue, not talking but living. And I believe that this is the more effective way of having the people integrated together, rather than talking to have the children from the age of 4 until the age of 20 we are taking for them. Minority, even some of our schools are Muslims, and others are Christians, are Muslims, are minority also in some of the schools. But we live together, we participate together, we handle the problems together in medical centers, in dialogue camps with the young people. I think we find every way new methods and new ways how to live together handling the problems.
Sie haben hier eine erste Erkenntnis schon gehört.
Well, advice is good, action is better. That's the first lesson that we've learned. Well, we've already heard from the federal president how important it is that we can only live together if we join forces. Is it possible to work together in the work that you do, to act together and join forces?
Well, first of all, I want to say that having listened to the President's speech, there seems to be very little left for me to say. It was a wonderful speech, and you voiced, Madam President, so much of what I believe in and what I've experienced from my work around the world in some of the most violent conflicts in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, in other places. And what I feel I can contribute here to this discussion are a couple of things. One is that I believe that how we create the policies and the structures for our interconnection has to start with each one of us as individuals. You know, I wear around my neck this little medallion which has written on it in tiny, tiny words the quote from Gandhi that many of you will know: "Be the change you want to see in the world." And so I believe that how we live our life with our relationship with the cashier or with somebody who is different to us is where we start multiculturalism and we make it into a reality. And so what I have seen, for instance, in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, where we are working to reintegrate child soldiers into the communities. So this is young people who have chopped off the limbs, who have killed others, and they now must come back and live in that community. How do they come back in? How are they received? And yet it is possible. If it's possible for people who have suffered so deeply with the other to receive, embrace and integrate, then I think it's possible for us in our privileged lives to be open to receive and embrace people who are different to ourselves and to let go of the fear that divides us. So I think so often the thing that's difficult about people who look and seem different to us is that we retreat into a fear. Perhaps we can replace that fear with curiosity. And we can seek to educate ourselves and others through dialogue, through deep discussion. In my own home country of South Africa, when we moved from apartheid to democracy, yes, it happened at a leadership level that there were negotiations, but the deepest thing that we did was that the people of my country got together, talked to each other, listened to each other, hour after hour after hour. That was our main work in the 4.5 years that it took us to transit from apartheid to democracy.
Thomas Wipf als Veranstalter hat.
Thomas Wipf, as the organizer, gave us the title for this discussion. Is the notion of a multicultural society an illusion? Can we translate this to mean, is the multi-religious society an illusion? Perhaps we could put it in those terms. Well, as you've already heard, we live in a country which, right from the beginning, has been multicultural, linguistically as well as religiously. And I think that multiculturalism of society is well established, it's tried and tested. But of course now multiculturalism does also now mean multi-religious, and we have seen that in the meeting between human beings, that their faiths and their values are taken as seriously as the way we live, and sometimes this is becoming more conscious. I see that there is an opportunity here. This is most important conclusion, and an opportunity for meetings. It doesn't lead to any loss of one's own identity. It is instead the precondition for the exercise of one's own identity. However, through the Mediterraneanization of our society, that's the multicultural Switzerland, which you see reflected in our food and in tourism, which we are also enjoy and are interested in. When coming back to our everyday life, it is not an illusion. It is. We know there's a more sober attitude to this now. We know that it's hard work in order to shape multicultural society. Mr. Lenz, we've also heard the question of multiculturalism really is, this is a transition, it's in transition to that of a multi-religious. Now, you as somebody specializing in Islamic studies, what about this coexistence of Christians and Muslims? Is it only a question of the masses because of quantities, because we've now got more Muslims than we had, or what? The answer. Well, this is it's a very multifaceted problem, I think, a multi-layered problem. Multiculturalism is a definite feature of our cultural landscape. We've always been multicultural. So in that sense, it isn't an illusion. It's more difficult when it comes to religiosity, religionism. If you look at the Swiss situation, for centuries now, we're not just Christian. For centuries, we've had Jewish people living in Switzerland. And for that, and it's not so long. It's not very long ago that Jews got fully equal rights in Switzerland as well as in Europe, more nationalist, more widely, more generally. So one wanted to put this in provocative terms. One could say that the Christian world is having difficulty with integrating other religious minorities, and the Jews are one such minority. I should remind you that the Jewish communities, too, although they've been for centuries in Switzerland, in most cantons, they're not recognized. They don't have legal status in most cantons. And we've got a new component now being added to this mix, which is the Islamic people. So, but actually, in terms of numbers, the Jews represent only a small minority. Perhaps you've got 350 to 400,000 of the Muslim community. So we've got another factor being added now, whereas the Jewish ones were only 20,000, let's say. So this is the entire problem and there's the entire problem of immigration and the cultural differences of people. It often is connected with religion, but not necessarily so. And I think Switzerland still faces a major challenge as to how all of this can best be managed, and how we can integrate all of this into our political conceptions. The moderator, I'd like to come back to you, to Mr. Florenzi was saying that historically speaking, Christianity has had problems in integrating other religions. Do you accept that? Not theologically, because we are aware that the Jewish religion is at the root of Christianity, and so the biggest theological recognition of the past century, as well as the liberation theology, that has also been noted. We've gone back to our roots in that sense, and when I hear Christians from Jerusalem, they have lived together with Muslims and Jews for centuries. All three religions have coexisted. So this is more a cultural and social question than it is a religious one, I think. Moderator, well, you and your party represent part of the Swiss population which have doubts and fears about multiculturalism and about the multi-religious society. What fears are these? Well, ladies and gentlemen, the federal president, I don't want to play the devil's advocate here.
Danke.
I was invited to play the devil's advocate somewhat, and so I've already received the first compliment. I'm being taken seriously. Let me say, fears. Well, you speak of fears. You speak of people who obviously think there is a danger looming here. Well, I'd like to emphasize first of all, so that I'm not misunderstood, Switzerland, as our president has told us, is an exemplar of a successful multicultural society. That's a fact. We've got 4 languages, we have a number of cultures, we have major differences in attitudes and mentalities, but nevertheless we have a common shared will, which is expressed in our Eidgenossenschaft, in our confederation. So integration is the key. Language is the key for integration. Work, education, this is the key for successful integration. And where the fears begin to arise and certain prejudices begin to arise is where you have people present who are, unfortunately, are not just automatically accepted under our legal system. And very specifically, I was interested to hear Frau Lindsay, is it really the case that there are people who are partly Muslim who say, or who live in such a way as to assume that, as to place very high value on the Sharia, perhaps indeed a higher value than our own legal order, our legal system? If that's the case, then I have to say that whoever comes to us, and this is the precondition for a successful multiculturalism or successful integration, whoever comes to us doesn't have to adapt, I hate that word, but what they have to do is to respect. They have to recognize that there are certain legal standards in effect, in force. There's a certain culture obtaining. It's Western Christian culture is the priority culture, and that is absolutely decisive. And the second thing is the second source of fears and apprehensions is the numbers. Many people can be integrated into another culture, but at some point they come up against a numerical limit, the limit of numbers. In 1990, we had about 170,000 Muslims living in Switzerland, and you heard practically nothing about them. Now we've got almost 400,000 Muslims, and people are wondering what's going to happen next. What further claims are going to be made on our country? What further demands may be made? And let me close by a comment. A highly respected statesman who died long ago, Charles de Gaulle. Now, de Gaulle said, in connection with the Algerian conflict and with problems arising in North Africa and the immigration from North Africa into France, it's well and good. In 1959 he said this, it's very good that there are yellow, black, brown French as well. But it must always remain a small minority. Otherwise, France will no longer be France. And it is primarily a Christian Western country which belongs to the Latin cultural realm. And if it's an uncontrolled, if it continues in an uncontrolled manner, one day it's no longer going to be my home. It's not going to be Colombe les deux églises, it's going to be Colombe les deux mosquées, the Colombe of the 2 mosques. Well, I'd like to pick up on that. Our foreign guest, Susan Collins Marks, on the podium with us. Well, for a long time in Switzerland, we've been discussing very intensively and on the social level whether mosques should be built in Switzerland and whether women should wear headscarves, whether Muslim children should not be included in the compulsory educational system. Do you think that's interesting or important, or what is your view?
I think what's important is that this is discussed, and that this is discussed deeply rather than one group of people sitting and making the decision for another group of people. I believe that the integration of people is made much easier and in fact is facilitated by that kind of acceptance. In fact, I think that there are 4 principles for creating a multicultural society. And this is from my experience in so many other countries, not from experience at all in your country. And these are one, that there needs to be a top-down and bottom-up approach to this. In other words, we have to have the leadership and we need to have the people of the country engaging in what this should look like and how it should move forward. Secondly, there needs to be inclusivity. You cannot leave people out of the discussion. Everybody has to be engaged. There's a principle we have in negotiations. We say anybody who is left out of the negotiations, who feels that they should be there, will sabotage them. And think about that, what we do in our own lives. The third principle is one of healing and restoration, that when there has been a clash, there's always pain, there's always damage, there is always wounding. And when, even in a society where there hasn't been a war, where there's a feeling by some people that they are not being received, there will be that wounding. That must be healed. And the fourth thing is that the socio-economic aspect of it. I think that we see in many of our Western societies that there is, for instance, if we look at what has happened in France, in Paris, we have seen that the economic situation of many of the immigrants, the people who are feeling alienated, has contributed deeply to creating and exacerbating divides. So, just to sum that up, I believe that learning to live with each other, learning coexistence, being willing to extend ourselves to make that happen is probably the most important thing that we face, because if we don't and if we have conflict, the results are that nothing works, because conflict, which turns into violent conflict, destroys everything.
Zu welchen belongs now? Zu welchen der 4 Punkte?
Well, under which of these 4 points should we be discussing this question of the minorities and so on?
I believe that we need to be holding all of these points as we go forward with the discussion. It in fact is a very good question, in that it is an example of how, when we try and separate things out, when we try and separate people out, when we try and separate cultures or religions out, and we say one is different, and we start to say mine is true, mine is right, or I'm only going to approach a piece of it, that we get into trouble. We need a holistic approach.
Herr Baiady.
Baiady.
It's almost what I have said, but when we talk, the more we talk about conflicts and about bringing the people together, this deepens the desperation of the people, because you don't see what we are talking about. So the more we talk, the more we say we want to be one, the more we say we have to be tolerant to the others, this deepens the separation of the people, because the people are looking to see how can we live together, how can even the laws has to be reviewed, because some of the laws are deepening the separation, even in separating the people, the women and male and females. They have to see practically our life, not our talks.
Welche Stichworte?
What key words are there in your mind, are discussed in the interreligious dialogue? What are the hot subjects? What are the dangerous subjects under discussion with you?
Ich meine Herr Baiady.
I mean Mr. Baiady, actually. I meant you.
He's asking you.
Yes.
Ja.
But
Welche sind für
Which for you, well, with us, it's headscarves, mosques, and so on. Those are the difficult subjects which are under discussion here between Christians and Muslims. What for you in Egypt, in the interreligious dialogue, are the difficult points?
I think this issue was tackled by even the Muslims themselves. Some people, some leaders of the Islam think that this is not a religious part, covering the head. It is not a part of the religion. One of our ministers in the government, the Minister of Culture, said, I don't have any woman veiled in my office, because it is not a religious part. So even among the Muslims, they are not on the same way of accepting this. This is a habit. It is not a part of the religion. So even among the Muslims themselves, We accept it, we tolerate it. We have in the school some girls who are veiled. We accept them. This is their freedom. We don't prevent them from being veiled because this is what they want. So we have the girls, Muslims veiled and unveiled. Christians, of course, they are not veiled. So we accept it as a traditional part. People are free to act or to do what they want. Yeah.
Danke. Thomas Witt, Sie haben sich gemeldet.
Thomas Witt, you wanted to say something. Well, this question of mosques having to do with migration or immigration. The history of humanity is a history of migrations, and I don't think I'm the only one who thinks that. The federal president also pointed that out. So if you look at the human history, there's always an interaction going on between the already established people and the incomers, it is not only those who are on the move who are in trouble. Those who are already settled also sometimes come under attack. So we have to look at our own roots, the roots of our own religion. The situations which have arisen in the question of mosques that's an interesting issue. It's not so much that most people in our country have difficulty in conceding the right of Muslims to live their lives. It's just that they need to be made publicly visible. It's a question of the responsibility we all share. A religious symbol can be abused, it can be misused, meanings can be read into it. Politicians there's a great political and social interest is that people who belong to other religions also need to be transparent and open in what they demonstrate, in what they show, and they should have the same opportunities. This is covered by the freedom of religion and freedom of belief. And there's no alternative to that. You can't make an immigration policy
zu unseren Rechten stehen, und ich vertraue ganz stark auf diese politische Kohärenz.
You can't build it on a right to be settled. In our federal constitution, well, if we cleave to the law, then we can make demands. For example, on Muslim people, they must make it clear: is this a political assembly, or is this a faith community? Is it a meeting of the faithful? We can't just be passive vis-à-vis the situation. It's our own political society. We must stick to our own freedom of religion, our own legal order or system. There's no alternative to all of that. And if we do that, then we can also require that it happens, that the society is then tolerable or then works.
Die richtigen Stichworte.
Well, mosques and headscarves, are these the right keywords or not? Well, it's a bit difficult to say, isn't it? They're not necessarily the right keywords from our point of view as Muslims, but clearly these are the ones under discussion. And there are two mosques in Switzerland for the past 20 years. One was built back in the 60s in Zurich, and the other at the end of the 70s, in the late 70s in Geneva. So nothing much has changed in Switzerland in that regard. And I can't quite see why in certain circles that is being seen as such a big deal. I don't think that's very helpful. I think Muslims should be given an opportunity to move into greater visibility and to, as Thomas Witt was saying, we shouldn't prevent their greater visibility. When I talked about the legal system, I didn't actually mean the Sharia, which has been suggested as an issue. If there are people who understand things. Well, it's really only a handful of people. It's not the majority of Muslims who see things in those terms. And that's not what I was trying to say. I didn't mean that there should be any difficulty with Muslims forming corporations, but that it should be possible for them to enter into society. So there should be transparency so that it should be possible for the rest of us to see who the leaders are. And I think that was the point of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Lenzin, this is a bit too simple. Someone who defends different point of view, and then you just say, well, they don't really understand anything about it, as you said, regarding Sharia. I lay claim to the fact that I've studied the whole matter very carefully. Perhaps I don't know all the details of Islam and all the secret, hidden parts of it. And I'm not stupid and I'm not against it, but I have something against certain movements which are just the reality. Not so long ago, a clever man from Germany, a religious scientist, said that of course, one can reproach Christianity and other major world religions for having been willing to do missionary work and to apply violence, but there is a difference, and he underlined this. In contrast with Christianity, Islam has not undergone a deep-going reformation. So he says that a strict Muslim will follow the rules of Sharia, and there the rules that apply to women are very, very harsh, very strict. And in Switzerland and in other areas, there is a collision because of this, a collision of points of view. And we wouldn't be sitting up here if there were no problems. If there were no problems, we could sit here and talk about something different. Or we could go off for drinks and say the world is wonderful. But there are problems, not only in the area of Islam or Muslim world, and there are certain problems with regard to people of Balkan origin, from Kosovo, from Albania, where the points of view or the ideas simply are different, mentality is different, and where one has a tendency of solving problems rather by applying violence. There we are dealing with people who have a different kind of tradition. I've seen schools in Bosnia where what goes on is completely different from what we're used to in Switzerland. And the person who comes from that kind of background may be shocked by the different conditions encountered when moving to a different country. So we have to be aware of this. This has some meaning for schools, for crime, for tolerance. This brings me to this question. Those who don't practice tolerance sufficiently, and it's a question I put to the churches as well, how tolerant do we have to be vis-à-vis of those who are not tolerant enough, don't practice tolerance enough? That's the topical question. Well, before we get bogged down in this question of Sharia, I would like to pick up one point that Mr. Fehr mentioned quite rightly, and that is standards, the norms. What are the rules that have to be observed in Switzerland? So first of all, we have to exactly establish what the rules are and who lays them down. Obviously, we have a criminal code, and it has to be implemented. That is, of course, the case. But who lays down the rules and who sanctions, Mr. Wipf? Well, in Switzerland, there is no collision of cultures and religion. I have observed that most Swiss and most of the foreigners who have moved to Switzerland are coping very sensibly and in a measured way with these challenges. So it is also a great challenge to the politicians, those politicians who always see things very negatively. I'm in favor of looking at it in the other way. You have to see it as an enrichment. It is a supplementation of our own culture and identity. But we have a job in common. We have to make sure that our constitution, which also enshrines the fundamental values and the openness to variety and multiculturalism, to make sure that the constitution is applied. It's very bad to already approach everyone who is not of the same persuasion with suspicion. It is obvious that fanaticism exists in all religions, also in all ideologies. Christianity, the Christian religion, that's the topic of the next forum, has this ambivalence of peacemaking and not peacemaking. A lot of work has been done in the field of peacemaking, but there's also been a lot of tinkering with fire, of violence. Obviously, it's one of our basic questions. Where do we come from? What are we here for? And so on and so forth. So we shouldn't practice this culture of suspicion. Potential extremists are nourished by this suspicion. What we have to work on and build on is on what we have in common rather than what separates us. There'll always be differences between individuals and between religions. There's no doubt about that. In this conversation, I have found confirmation for myself that the Christian belief, that Christian religion, Christianity, has its justification. But at the same time, other religions have just as much their justification. So that's why I'm very suspicious about this ideology of suspicion, because we should see everything as an enrichment, not as a curtailment. Susan Collins?
Thank you. I think that multiculturalism, everything we're talking about here, is a decision. If we decide for it, if we decide this is the kind of society we want to have in whichever place we live, then we will do it. And I think making that fundamental decision is the very first step. It sounds simplistic, but it's actually very important. Because if we're ambivalent about it, well, is this going to work or isn't it, then we open ourselves up to the doubts. And I believe the fear that is at the root of any doctrine or ideology that is trying to push people away. And that when we come from a place of accepting the legitimacy of the other, we are then able to together craft the kind of society we want. And we're also able to keep a very open mind and to understand that, for instance, in Islam, I'm a part of the Council of 100 Leaders. I sit on the executive committee, which is one of the World Economic Forum initiatives. And I work in the Islamic Western dialogue throughout the world. And I know that there are often very simplistic interpretations that we hear in the West about what Islam really is, and that there's a much deeper discussion to be had than some of those the things that are just trotted out as this is what Islam is. And I think that's why I keep saying that instead of deciding in our own minds that this is what Islam is, or this is what Christianity is, or this is what Judaism is, that we engage in a very, very deep dialogue so that we begin to understand each other. And I believe that we can solve anything. Do you know that, just as an aside on a completely different thing, in my beloved South Africa, as we did the transition from apartheid to democracy, the two people, the Minister of the Constitution and the leader of the ANC, the chief negotiator, the two of them came together in such a relationship that they've said to me on many occasions, we felt we could deal with any issue, not because the issues weren't horrendously difficult, but because they had built a relationship of trust between the two of them, where they could truly engage. knowledge and truly work through what was needed and then mobilize behind it. So I think that we need to be careful in our societies to truly find a way to bring all the people into the discussion of what our future should look like, and it's very, very critical that we do that right now.
Yeah.
Baiady.
Yeah, we have to admit that in each religion there is a left part and right part. There are some people in some religion who are acting violently. But our mission, our role, is to how to widen the middle, the medium people in all the religions. Jews, Christians, Muslims. We find the people who are asking for tolerance. So we have to encourage this area to widen the medium area and to shorten, to narrow the left and the right wings, that we can live together. And this is an effort. It is not done in a minute. It is not done in just sitting and discussing. It is a building, and building what is done in hundreds or tens of years now on walls. It needs a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of cooperation between West and East, that we can learn from each other, take our experiences and see your experiences and work as one body, just to narrow this kind of left and right.
I'd like to also take this opportunity to share the discussion with the audience. If you have any questions for the panelists, we'll try and answer them as much as possible. First question here from the floor. And wait for the microphone so that you can be heard by everyone, including the interpreters. I have a question and I'd like to make a suggestion. There's no doubt that the major debate about the multicultural society is marked by Christianity and Islam. And a lot of the images that we have come from the mass media. There's a lot of prejudice because of the wars in Iran and Afghanistan. So what we see in the media marks us. So what role is played by the mass media when it comes to public opinion? What role could they play so that we speak more with one another rather than trying to drown our voices out? I was recently in Tehran and I was very, very surprised by these multicultural groups that I would never have known existed by just reading the mass media. And there's also this question of the relationship between men and women. I met the Nobel Prize winner, Baiady, and she asked me to say this on her behalf here in the forum. There is a movement of giving the same position and status of women as men in the Constitution. So I brought along some pamphlets and some papers and an initiative that you can sign in favor of this to sign in favor of this initiative, and there is a link on the internet which you can also consult, and I think it's www.change.org. Who would like to respond? Mrs. Lenzin? Yes, I think that the media have a very important role to play. They have this multiplier effect of a problem. They focus on a single event and then blow it up. These are not singular minor events, but maybe singular large events and wars and other events. And this has a feedback effect that affects the Muslims very much, because they are made responsible for all violent acts abroad, even if the situation in Switzerland is very peaceful, where there may be quite different problems that are in the forefront. And this was really the main point when it came to the cartoons, because in Switzerland there was really no problem. And then because of the violence in the Middle East and all the other situations, there was this feedback effect. And the Muslims then suddenly were accountable for what happens elsewhere. And they say, well, what can I do? Why should it be my fault what happens elsewhere? So an Albanian will maybe say, I have nothing to do with the Arabs, and the Turks will say, I have nothing to do with the Albanians. I've also seen the opposite happen. I recently spent some time in Indonesia and dealt mainly with church circles there, and they are suffering exactly from the same situation there. They feel accountable for the Americans' policy in Iran and Afghanistan. So the churches there are made responsible for the acts that have been committed in the Abu Ghraib prison and so on and so forth. So the media are not playing very fair, but then unfortunately they have their own rules that they follow. And only bad news is good news. This is something that affects the whole world, not just the Islamic world. Even in Switzerland, I have observed similar phenomena. I get together with different groups of different religion, especially women's groups with a Muslim and Jewish background. Many of these women are also lawyers. We discuss all these issues, and it's a multi-layered problem that you cannot solve very simply or put just into a simple basket. Mr. Fehr? Well, I certainly don't lay claim to being able to assess in a conclusive way the relationship between men and women in the Islamic world, but I've read about this, I've heard things, and I even know Muslim families. And Mrs. Lenzin, you say that there are no big differences, but what I have seen is that, as a rule, women stay at home, are responsible for the household. Sometimes they are veiled, but that is not always the rule. And from my experience, it is the men who take the decisions. Let me give you an example. I recently had a long conversation with the city president of Rorschach, where they have 40% of the population that are foreigners. A major part of them are Muslims or Islamic. And his policy is to promote and to integrate. And I learned from him that in Rorschach, they would like to teach women, the Muslim women, a little more about Swiss culture. They have now made it mandatory for new immigrants to take language courses. That is to say, the women have to follow these courses. This means that they have more contact with other people from different parts of the population. The moderator is pleading in favor of brevity so that everyone can participate in the discussion. Mr. Wimpf. Well, as a man, it's very difficult to talk about women. I'm very happy to be a member of a church where there is equality between men and women. I'm very happy to be a national of a country where the constitution makes the equality between men and women a basic rule. But even in my church, it took a long time until we reached this point, and we are still not quite there. And to put it very pointedly, Mr. Fehr, and to exaggerate, it would be quite nice if your political party and the circles that are close to it changed their view of the relationship between men and women, which is also very similar to what you described. But of course we should help and promote and support Muslim women. We have to help them become more emancipated. May I say something very briefly about the media? If we didn't accept what the media offered us by way of food, then the media would not behave the way it does. Sometimes we feel like the rabbit that has been totally hypnotized by the snake. Everyone wants to come in on this.
the question about the media, and to say that one of the things we can do is to make our own media. And my organization, Search for Common Ground, does that a lot. And one of the things that we're just starting now is to do a reality show, which is an exchange between Egypt and the United States. So we will take, for instance, an Egyptian lawyer to go and live for a month as a lawyer in the United States and vice versa, and to film them. And in this way, to make a different kind of reality show, not one where people are eliminated and have to eat worms, but one in which people really experience living in each other's lives. And I think it's when we do this kind of thing in the media that we can begin to really offer to all of us who, after all, we don't know much. We can't always travel to places. We can't always meet people from other places, but we can if we create this kind of media, if we encourage our local media to create it, we can begin to really make change through the media.
Weitere Fragen bitte.
More questions? Various questions, various people have got their hands up.
Thank you very much. I'm Everett Ikma, Design to Context in Switzerland, Zurich. I have a question. What can economic powers do in this debate? Because we heard cultural speakers and religious speakers and political speakers, but what can do the economic powers in this debate? Because, for instance, what is since last year on the agenda, creative economy is a very hot item. And creative economy is based on differentiation and, so to say, seeing the value of difference.
Let me begin by saying this. Well, if you look at the figures from the figures, about 20% of young people aren't having any training in professions or in occupations. And so a large number don't have any adequate education so that thereafter they can be accepted in the labour market and get jobs. So these are the poor devils, if you like, and so we must make sure that the language is an essential tool for integration, so that education and work that is on offer, so that the will to integrate and to learn the language has to come from there. And that's the contribution that the economy can make, and I think it's a very large contribution. Thank you.
Experiences. Those who are acting violently, they are from the poor families. Someone who was bombing himself just to kill others, he was paid only $2 to do this. And when we discuss it, they say those people have nothing to lose. So they are taught that if they kill somebody, maybe against him or his religion, will go to heaven, and he is not losing anything because he is living, he's starving. So economics is very important in this case. Also, in the matter of women, we have to call for equality. I have experienced myself when my church was against women ordination. I asked the women if they stopped going to church for one Sunday, all the women, and then they changed it. And nowadays the woman is accepted in all the levels of the administration of the church. So we have to be beside those who are in need, like the poor or the women, to have equality in our society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thomas Friedman hat ein Buch geschrieben.
Thomas Friedman wrote a book, The World is Flat. Women in the United States, for example, in their favorite restaurant, if they want to reserve a table, they've got a nice lady from India on the phone, and I'd like to sit at the back by the window, and then he says, well, globalization is making the world flat, is overcoming borders, and I think that the economy certainly does have a power, not just to make the world flat economically, but in other respects as well. Further questions? Perhaps any women would like to ask questions? I see a certain male dominance going on here. Right at the back, lady. On the right. With a glove, I think I see somebody.
Ja, mit dem schwarzen Handschuh, genau.
The black gloves back there. Thank you very much. I would like to ask you, isn't the individual human being getting short shrift with you? I've been active in the Catholic Church, and I'm fighting for my life now, and I've been an ecumenical team. I know all these people who are at the top, and I have to fight for my life. I've got 5 heads. I was 9 months homeless in Switzerland. 6 months I didn't have enough to eat. I had a large garden, and that's the only way I was able to survive so far. I don't have a garden anymore today. You might laugh, but I have to keep fighting and fighting to make a place for myself in Switzerland and in asking for help. I also asked one of the bishops for help. He was my bishop. And I've seen how many of our foreigners, what they have in head. And I've written to the federal authorities about all of these. And the moderator. Well, thank you very much for your contribution, but I think it is very important, and everybody here on the podium understands. We're talking about the situation of foreigners in the country. We mustn't forget the disadvantaged Swiss themselves, in our midst. I think there's another lady who asked for the floor. Thank you. Well, all this question about integration of Muslims and foreigners and so on. What about the will of Switzerland to actually to let these people integrate? It's not just a matter for politics or politicians. Every individual has to make a decision, has to say, I accept these people, and that I accept them and regard them as having equal rights. If people want to integrate, and they have to be given jobs. It is down to the individual themselves, I think. It's very important that we look at that aspect of it and the responsibility of all individuals. So thank you very much, says the moderator. We take note of what you said. The gentleman with the blue shirt on the left.
Hello. I'm a teacher from the International School of Geneva, and we have roughly 110 nationalities. My French is awful. My German is non-existent. One of the rules in our constitution, which is about 80 years old, is that any worker in the school, be it Muslim, Hindu, Christian, if they wish to take a holiday on their religious festival day, for example, Diwali, it's festival rights, they may do so. It's part of the constitution. I don't take that holiday because I'm too busy and I'm too happy to be with my students. But I at least respect the school over the 80 years that they've put in those rules. Now, how difficult would it be for the Swiss constitution or the European constitution to include that gesture? I'm not here to change Switzerland. I also own a home here in Geneva, and if Mr. Fehr was my neighbor, I happily sweep snow with him and have a coffee afterwards and struggle through the language. Does that make me a bad Swiss? And if that lady wants to come and stay with me and eat with me, that's no problem. Surely Swiss values should be the same as human values.
Herzlichen Dank. Thomas Wipp.
Thank you, Thomas Wipp. Well, I have a contribution to make on this point. We've got a very good and pragmatic approach of taking account of people from other religions in Switzerland, the Jewish men and women. And lots of us, I think, have got school friends. And this is a good and pragmatic solution on the ground, and I think we've done very well with that. However, but I do hear from Muslims increasingly that there are signs of lack of respect. A Muslim woman with a headscarf, that's another question, where she wears it. And I've got a clear view about that. It gets spat on the street. And Jews in Switzerland say it's getting harder and harder to find pragmatic solutions dealing with these holidays. For example, if you have exams on a Saturday, we as citizens, we have to be watchful and we have to help to find solutions. But on the other hand, it should also go without saying, and this has been confirmed by Muslims, that Christmas must remain Christmas. And the signs of Christian Christmas should continue to exist in school, in mutual respect for sure, but all of that shouldn't be done away with or withdrawn. Well, says the moderator, I see that it's already 2:15, and we need to draw this to a close. I'd just like to pick up a couple of sentences from our guests from abroad, who were some very important things that they said in this discussion. One, I think, it was said that talking is important. Speaking and talking, dialogue is critically important. But something has to actually happen as a result. Something has to remain. There has to be some residue, not just talk. And the second thing, which I felt very interesting and exciting, that I heard from Susan Marks, and it's very important that we accept multiculturalism. Or we may decide not to accept it, but in that case, but there has to be a decision to accept it. Well, thank you very much to all of you for this discussion, panelists, and you to the audience for coming in such large numbers. And I have to see what's coming next at 3:30 this afternoon about the sources of peace, or are religions are the source of peace, or are they a source of disruption in world policy? Please, can you take your headsets outside, take them with you, and hand them in outside? Thank you very much. Have a nice weekend.